You're listening to Sleepy History Tales, where forgotten truths whisper through the pages of time, and the past never quite stays buried. But before we begin tonight's story, where are you listening from? Kentucky, Michigan? Or maybe you're drifting off somewhere quiet in Arizona. Drop a comment below and let us know what state or country you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far these tales travel. In 1918, a group of construction workers in rural Kentucky unearthed a rusted metal box buried beneath the old foundation of a farmhouse. Inside were 17 leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting, though faded, remained meticulous. The contents: a detailed log of 637 human bodies sold to medical institutions across America between the years 1784 and 1821. Each entry ended with a chillingly uniform phrase: "Coffin weighted appropriately. Family none the wiser." Even more disturbing were the entries marked with a small red cross 418 in total, signifying that these specimens were not yet dead when selected by the Ashworth brothers for their grisly business. Before we continue down this dark path, I want to invite you to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. We uncover the stories that textbooks tend to avoid, the ones that make you question how much of the past we've really understood. And if you're a long-time listener, let us know in the comments, what's the creepiest historical secret from your home state? You might just hear it featured here someday. Now let's travel back to the wild hills of eastern Kentucky, late 18th century. Deep in the pine woods, there's a narrow clearing called Death Valley. In spring, the wildflowers bloom brightly, but don't be fooled, the name isn't poetic. Between 1784 and 1821, this secluded patch of land became the heart of one of the most grotesque criminal enterprises in early American history. A network of death and deception that spanned 6 states, cost hundreds of lives, and involved not just grave robbers, but professors, physicians, and even public officials. At the center of it all were 3 brothers: Ezekiel Ashworth, the undertaker; Moray Ashworth, the gravedigger; and Zachariah Ashworth, the town preacher. It wasn't just the calculated murders that horrified people. It was how the brothers used their positions of trust to turn grief into profit. Families would arrive at Death Valley Cemetery to bury their loved ones. They wept, they prayed, while empty coffins filled with stones and sand were lowered into the earth. The real bodies had already been harvested, preserved and prepared for shipment, sent to medical schools up and down the eastern seaboard. Schools that were desperate for cadavers and rarely asked questions. As demand grew, so did the operation. They expanded beyond grave robbing. They turned to murder. Solitary travelers, drifters, traders passing through eastern Kentucky's quiet counties. The kind of people no one would notice missing. The kind of people whose names were written into the ledger beside that crimson cross. By the final years of the operation, the ledgers revealed dozens of accomplices: doctors, professors, even elected officials, all complicit in a business of death, all profiting from a trade in human lives. This entire history might have been lost buried like the bodies themselves, had it not been for one woman. In the autumn of 1821, Elizabeth Caldwell buried her husband in Death Valley Cemetery. But something didn't feel right. The coffin was too light. Her questions would set off a chain reaction that would expose the full extent of the horrors committed by the Ashworth family. At that time, the area that would later be known as Ashworth Creek was just a cluster of frontier cabins deep in the Kentucky woods, about 50 miles from the Virginia border. No one could have imagined that in such a remote place, a machine of death had been quietly operating for decades, hidden behind smiles, sermons, and the sound of shovels at dusk. So, what do you think so far? Have you ever heard of the Ashworth brothers before tonight? Or is this your first encounter with the shadows of Death Valley? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget, history never truly sleeps, especially not here. By the spring of 1784, the small settlement that would later be known as Ashworth Creek had begun to flourish. Around 40 families, most of them migrating from Virginia and North Carolina, had made this quiet patch of land their home. Fresh off the heels of the Revolutionary War, they came in search of fertile soil freedom and a fresh start. What they found was a wilderness full of promise and peril. The community was staunchly Baptist, with that rugged, self-reliant spirit so common on the American frontier. The nearest sizable town was nearly 2 days away by horseback, leaving Ashworth Creek largely cut off, especially during the harsh Kentucky winters, when the mountain passes froze over. It was in this landscape of rugged independence that the Ashworth brothers arrived. The year was 1784. 3 men, 3 trades, 1 purpose. Ezekiel, the eldest, at 32, presented himself as a seasoned undertaker from Philadelphia. Morai, quiet and watchful, was a skilled carpenter and coffin maker. And Zachariah, the youngest, at just 27, was perhaps the most valuable of all, a formally trained Baptist preacher, fresh from seminary in Virginia. A true rarity in these remote parts, the brothers were a godsend, or so it seemed. Within 6 months, they had established a fully operational cemetery on 5 acres of land at the eastern edge of town, a place they named Death Valley Cemetery. When questioned about the grim name, Zachariah calmly explained that it was biblical, the valley of the shadow of death from the book of Psalms. Not a warning, but a comfort. The location was perfect, high enough to avoid flooding, soil soft enough for quick digging, and critically tucked beside a little used trade route that quietly connected to roads leading East Virginia, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, Boston. Behind the charming white chapel where Zachariah preached on Sundays stood a modest but efficient complex. Ezekiel's embalming room where the dead were prepared, Morai's workshop where he crafted coffins in various styles from plain pine boxes to polished hardwood masterpieces. And at the edge of the woods, the brothers shared 2-story home separated from the cemetery by a grove of pines, quiet, private, watchful. To the townsfolk, the Ashworth brothers were a blessing. Ezekiel was solemn and dignified, with an almost sacred reverence for his work. Grieving families found peace in the care he gave their loved ones. Morai rarely spoke, but his craftsmanship spoke volumes. His coffins were works of art, even the simplest ones, sanded smooth as river stones. But it was Zachariah who truly captivated the community. He was handsome, charming, with a gift for language that could bring even the most stoic settler to tears. His sermons stirred hearts, his prayers over fresh graves left listeners trembling. Children followed him like he was one of the disciples, and the bereaved clung to his every word. The Reverend has God's own gift for easing suffering, said Martha Tunney after Zachariah presided over her husband's funeral in the brutal winter of 1785. I don't know how we'd survive death out here without the Ashworths to guide us through it. But no one in Ashworth Creek knew the truth. The brothers hadn't stumbled upon this town. They had chosen it. Carefully, deliberately. For nearly a year before settling, the Ashworths traveled, visiting dozens of frontier communities, studying their populations, their remoteness, and most importantly, their proximity to the growing network of medical schools in the East. Because in the late 18th century, anatomical science was booming in America. Medical colleges in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Baltimore were just beginning to flourish. But they all faced the same crisis: a severe shortage of human cadavers for anatomical study. And by law, those schools were typically limited to the bodies of executed criminals, a supply that was thankfully rare. But in Ashworth Creek, there were no laws, no watchdogs, no one to ask questions, and no one to answer them. Do you see where this is going? Are you beginning to wonder how many sermons Zachariah delivered over graves that held only sand? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Would you have trusted the Ashworth brothers back then? Would you have followed that preacher into the valley of the shadow of death? In the final decades of the 18th century, medical education in America faced a dilemma that no professor dared speak of openly: a desperate shortage of cadavers. Demand far exceeded supply. The law permitted only the bodies of executed criminals to be used for dissection, but executions were few, and students were many. As the new science of anatomy surged ahead, desperate schools turned to quieter solutions. A black market emerged, and in that market, a fresh, well-preserved body could command a small fortune. The Ashworth brothers were perfectly positioned to seize this opportunity. Ezekiel, with his time spent assisting at Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, had already built connections: doctors, instructors, and researchers who needed bodies and asked no questions. Morai, with his background in shipping, had learned the art of preservation, keeping goods intact over long, unpredictable journeys. And Zachariah, his religious title served as the ultimate disguise. Who would question a preacher's handling of the dead? We provide a service to the living and the dead. Ezekiel wrote in the very first entry of his ledger, dated June 17th, 1784. The deceased served the advancement of medical knowledge while their families received the comfort of proper burial rites. That the families believe they are burying their loved ones is a mercy. They need never know the higher purpose their departed now serve. In the beginning, the operation was cautious. When someone died in the settlement, the Ashworths were the natural choice. Ezekiel would arrive with a solemn nod, promise to prepare the body for viewing and escort it to his workshop. There, he would examine it carefully, checking for signs of disease or decay, anything that might make it unsuitable for dissection. Those deemed unfit were left to rest in peace. But for the others, the deception began. After the family said their goodbyes, viewing the loved one's peaceful face in an open casket, the body concealed beneath a burial shroud, Ezekiel would gently excuse them. He would explain that he needed a few final touches before sealing the coffin. Once alone, he lifted the body and opened a trapdoor hidden beneath his heavy wooden workbench. Below was a concealed cellar, silent and cold. There he began the process of preservation. Using a mixture of alcohol, salt, and ground herbs, Ezekiel injected the body's major blood vessels to slow decomposition. The body was then packed in salt and sawdust and placed into a narrow wooden crate crafted by Morai to resemble an ordinary tool chest. Meanwhile, upstairs, Morai filled the original coffin with rock sand or in winter frozen earth, carefully arranged to match the weight of a body. The coffin was sealed tight, ready for the funeral. Zachariah would then step forward to perform his part. With grace and power, he led a ceremony full of solemn poetry and eternal promises. He spoke of resurrection, of sacred rest, of reunion beyond the veil. No one cried harder than those who listened to his words. All the while, the body was not in the grave, but in the cellar, awaiting its journey east. In the early years, the brothers remained conservative. Their first year yielded 8 shipments, each one hand-selected, packed, and quietly dispatched to contacts in Philadelphia and New York. Payments ranged from $17 to $25 per body, an enormous sum considering a skilled laborer earned around $1 a day. The money arrived discreetly hidden within the pouches of traveling merchants who carried what they believed to be business documents. Received payment for subject number 8 today, Ezekiel wrote in April 1785. $23, our best price yet. Dr. H. at Pennsylvania Medical College specifically requested more specimens showing healed bone fractures. Must keep watch for appropriate subjects. By 1787, the business was growing. The brothers purchased additional land beside the cemetery and extended the road to connect more directly with the main trade route. They even began collecting bodies from settlements up to 20 miles away, offering their services to grieving families in outlying areas. That year, they shipped 15 cadavers, still selective, still careful, but confident. The isolation that made this community appealing now constrains our enterprise, Ezekiel noted. Zachariah suggests we must widen our reach. Morai has designed an improved preservation method that should allow bodies to remain suitable for study even after 2 weeks in transport. Ironically, the cemetery itself became a source of pride in the community. Graves were arranged in perfect rows. The headstones, some simple, some intricate, were carved by Morai himself. Clean paths, flowering shrubs, and the solemn white chapel made Death Valley Cemetery look more like a place of peace than the center of a chilling enterprise. Have you ever stood in a cemetery and felt like something was off, that the silence held more than just sorrow? Let me know in the comments. And if you're finding this story as unsettling as I am, don't forget to subscribe. There's so much more of America's shadowed past to uncover. Twice a year, as if to reinforce their sacred reputation, Zachariah Ashworth organized community gatherings at the cemetery. Neighbors came together to clean headstones, pull weeds, and plant flowers around the graves. The events ended somewhat unsettlingly to modern sensibilities, with a picnic held right on the cemetery grounds. To outsiders, this might seem macabre. But for the settlers of Ashworth Creek, death was not a distant abstraction. It was part of life. They saw no harm in honoring their dead with laughter and shared bread under the same trees that shaded their graves. No one questioned why the Ashworth brothers would occasionally vanish for a few days, saying they had to visit suppliers in larger towns or tend to family affairs back in Virginia. In truth, those trips were for delivering bodies to their medical clients or meeting with new buyers. As their network expanded, the brothers grew more sophisticated. They developed a system of coded correspondence, using letters exchanged discreetly through a network of post-riders. Bodies were referred to as study materials. Fresh corpses were green harvests. Preserved specimens became cured crops. Bodies with tumors or rare deformities were called knotted lumber, while a typical healthy male body that was straight grain. Each term sounded harmless to outsiders, but within their circle, it described human remains in chillingly agricultural terms. By 1790, business was booming. The brothers were now among the wealthiest residents in Ashworth Creek. Though they continued to live modestly, conscious of the need for discretion, they were quietly buying up land across eastern Kentucky, becoming influential property owners. Their wealth allowed them to improve their infrastructure. They expanded the underground cellar, adding proper ventilation, drainage, and even a hidden rear exit through the pines where carts could come and go without being seen. Above ground, nothing seemed amiss. Families mourned. Children sang hymns. Zachariah preached with fire and gentleness, and beneath their feet, the Ashworths carried on their grim work in total secrecy. They had constructed the perfect facade, trusted guardians of the dead, in a town that never thought to ask what truly happened once the casket was sealed. But everything changed on the morning of October 17th, 1791. A merchant passed through town carrying a letter from Dr. William Hammond of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, one of their most reliable buyers. The message was urgent, written in their established code. Our need for fresh specimens has become desperate. Current legislation has further restricted access to traditional sources. We are prepared to offer $40 per suitable subject, with bonuses for specimens of particular educational value. The advancement of American medicine depends on institutions like yours that understand necessities which transcend common sensibilities. $40, nearly double the usual price. More than a month's wages for a tradesman for one body. That night, Ezekiel opened his ledger and wrote with chilling clarity, $40 per subject changes our calculations entirely. At such rates, we need not wait for death to visit Ashworth Creek. Naturally, there are travelers on the Western Road who would not be missed. Solitary men seeking opportunity in the territories. Providence delivers them to our doorstep. It would be foolish to ignore such opportunity, and so the Ashworth brothers crossed a line they could never uncross. Their first intentional victim arrived the very next week, a nameless traveler seeking shelter in the chapel as an autumn storm rolled in. Zachariah found him there, soaked and shivering. He smiled warmly, invited the man to their home for dinner. He poured him a cup of wine, spiced and warming, and in that wine was a carefully measured mixture of herbs, alcohol, and alkaloids, a formula Ezekiel had learned back at Pennsylvania Hospital. It induced unconsciousness quickly, and then respiratory failure mimicking a natural death. The man never woke up. Subject number 73. Ezekiel wrote that night. Male, approximately 30 years. Robust physique, surgical scar present across abdomen. No identification found. Administered the solution at dinner. Effect was swift and appeared painless. Preservation begun within the hour. Should fetch premium price, Dr. Hammond specifically requested surgical specimens, and so began the next phase of the Ashworth operation. No longer just opportunistic grave robbers, they were now predators, hunting in the shadows of the Western Road, quietly expanding their body count. Let me ask you something, friend. At what point does a man lose his soul? Is it when he lies to the grieving, or when he quietly replaces their loved one with sand and stones? Or is it when he raises a glass in prayer, knowing what he poured into it? Let me know what you think, and if this story is getting under your skin, there's more to come. Hit subscribe and keep the lantern burning. We're just getting started. What began as a desperate solution for medical schools and a quiet act of deception by three brothers soon evolved into something much more organized and much more lethal. By 1792, the Ashworth brothers had entered the second phase of their grim enterprise, a methodical campaign of murder. They developed a set of criteria for choosing their victims: solitary travelers, preferably men moving westward without a clear destination or close family ties. The kind of people whose disappearance might never even be noticed. No letters, no lodgings, no one waiting at the other end. Zachariah, ever the charming preacher, took the lead in screening potential victims. He would engage them in friendly conversation outside the chapel or along the road, asking careful, pointed questions. Where are you headed? Do you have people waiting? Did you send word ahead? If the answers suggested that no one would come looking, the brothers would proceed. Ezekiel, meanwhile, kept watch near the crossroads where travelers passed into town. He noted who traveled alone, who appeared to carry valuables, just in case a staged robbery would later be needed to explain a death if a body were ever discovered. Morai had modified their hidden cellar into 3 separate chambers, allowing them to process multiple bodies simultaneously. During the busier travel seasons, they refined their methods. The original herbal solution used to induce death evolved into a blend of ingredients that broke down quickly in the bloodstream, leaving no detectable traces, even if someone were to conduct a rare examination. They learned how to destroy evidence to burning papers, scattering possessions, selling off valuables in distant towns on their delivery runs eastward. By 1795, the scale of the operation had increased dramatically. That year alone, 28 cadavers were sold to medical institutions. 19 of them were murders. The profits were staggering: over $1,100 in a single year, more than $23,000 in today's money. Our most productive season yet, Ezekiel wrote coldly. 3 physicians have requested more robust male subjects with orthopedic trauma. I will position myself along the river trail where laborers tend to pass through. If not for two things, ambition and expansion, the Ashworths might have continued undetected for years to come. But the world was changing. Medical schools were springing up all along the eastern seaboard, Boston, Richmond, Baltimore, each desperate for anatomical specimens. Demand exploded. So did opportunity. And with that opportunity came risk. The brothers began shipping more frequently. With more bodies on the road, the chance of discovery grew. They responded the only way they knew how with greater precision. They developed advanced preservation methods, allowing cadavers to survive long journeys without rotting. They commissioned false-bottomed wagons to carry bodies hidden beneath ordinary goods. They recruited merchants and stagecoach drivers, paying them to deliver mysterious crates labeled as medical supplies. Most didn't ask questions. Those who did were either paid more or sent away. But the most dangerous evolution, they began forging relationships with medical professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Doctors, professors, researchers. They understood the source. They welcomed it. Some even provided legal cover. Dr. M from Baltimore College has proven particularly valuable, Ezekiel wrote in 1797. His cousin serves as magistrate in Harford County and ensures our wagons pass without inspection. In exchange, we provide him with 2 specimens monthly, with emphasis on female subjects, which he claims are underrepresented in their teaching collection. With this kind of protection, the Ashworths felt invincible. Their clients now sent custom requests. Young men with developed musculature, elderly subjects with advanced diseases, women of childbearing age, children with congenital conditions, and the brothers delivered. They began targeting people not only for their vulnerability, but for their anatomy. Harvested a woman of approximately 24 years, Ezekiel noted in 1798. Unmarried, no local ties, clear pelvic structure, requested by Boston College for obstetric instruction. Their ledgers began to read like medical inventories, clinical code, and completely detached from human empathy. The final ledger, found in 1918, documented 43 named collaborators, not just doctors, sheriffs who ensured wagons were never stopped, judges who squashed complaints, even 2 state legislators who received payments or specimens for guaranteed protection across state lines. It was no longer just the Ashworths. It was a network, a system, a quiet conspiracy hidden beneath the banner of science. And then came the summer of 1800, a season that would mark another dark evolution in the brothers' enterprise. But we'll get to that in a moment. Let me ask you this. Do you think the doctors who accepted those bodies were just as guilty as the men who harvested them? Or does the pursuit of knowledge excuse the price? Let me know in the comments. And if this story has kept your pulse steady so far, I promise the next chapter might change that. Subscribe and I'll keep the lantern burning. By the early 1800s, Zachariah Ashworth had taken on a new role, one that elevated him not only in the eyes of Ashworth Creek, but in surrounding settlements as well. He became a traveling minister, preaching in distant churches and offering spiritual guidance to those in remote communities. But these pastoral visits were not solely about salvation. They were reconnaissance missions. During these trips, Zachariah took note of vulnerable individuals, the elderly who lived alone, the newly arrived settlers without strong local ties, the sick, the desperate. Then he would return with Ezekiel, introducing him as a traveling physician with access to treatments unavailable in these parts. For those who accepted their help, trusting the man of God and his quiet medical companion, the result was always the same. Acquired 3 subjects from Logan Creek this month, Ezekiel recorded in August 1801. Zachariah's position as a man of God continues to open doors that would otherwise remain closed. People trust a preacher who brings a doctor to their sickbed. Their faith is touching if misplaced. As time passed, the brothers grew bolder. They no longer restricted themselves to the forgotten or the friendless. When medical institutions offered extraordinary sums for specific specimen types, elderly women, children with physical deformities, young men with advanced musculature, they were willing to take greater risks. In these cases, they staged deaths carefully. A fall from a horse, a sudden drowning in the creek, a mysterious illness that resisted all treatment, all perfectly explainable, all quietly accepted. From 1800 to 1810, the ledgers document the shipment of 217 bodies. That's nearly 2 bodies per month, year after year. The majority of these were murders, not natural deaths. What the Ashworths had created was no longer just a scheme, it was a production line of death. Zachariah found the victims. Ezekiel administered the fatal solution. Morai handled preservation and packaging. Together, they had built a business on death and trust, a trust that only deepened. During this time, Zachariah's congregation swelled. People traveled from miles around to hear his powerful sermons on mortality, judgment, and the afterlife. He spoke with passion. He wept with the grieving, and his words struck deeply. Perhaps because deep down he believed in them himself. Ezekiel, meanwhile, was now consulted by neighboring towns, asked to help design cemeteries. And Morai, ever the craftsman, trained 2 young apprentices to help meet demand for his finely built coffins. These young men were never told about the true nature of the business. In a rare personal entry in 1804, Zachariah wrote, 20 years in this community, and they look to us for guidance on how to die well. If they only knew. We have become the most practiced shepherds of souls to the afterlife in all of Kentucky. Of course, no criminal enterprise lasts forever without danger. In spring of 1805, a traveling merchant mentioned a strange rotting odor coming from one of the crates he'd been paid to transport to Richmond. He said something to Morai. That night he was invited to dinner. He was never seen again. His name does not appear in the ledger, but subject number 283, recorded in 1807, is described simply as male mid-40s, strong build, minor merchant, no known affiliations. Another threat arrived in the form of a man named Dr. Thomas Bennett, a new physician trained in Philadelphia who settled in Ashworth Creek. It didn't take long for Bennett to notice something odd. Too many solitary travelers seemed to die unexpectedly. Too many graves for a town so small. Too many stories that didn't add up. He began asking questions. 3 months after opening his practice, Dr. Bennett died of what Zachariah solemnly described as brain fever. He was one of the very few Ashworth victims who was actually buried in Death Valley Cemetery. Still, despite these close calls, the brothers' confidence only grew. By 1810, they had expanded their reach again, this time by using middlemen in Lexington and Louisville. These intermediaries connected the Ashworths to medical schools throughout the eastern United States, handling correspondence payments and even scheduling. But with expansion came exposure, more couriers, more recipients, more people who knew at least part of the truth. And the ledgers from this era reflect a change, not just in tone, but in structure. Detailed expense tracking, shipment logs, coded contracts. They weren't just body snatchers anymore. They were businessmen. Let me pause here and ask you, if you had lived in Ashworth Creek back then, would you have suspected the truth? Could you ever imagine the smiling preacher, the gentle doctor, and the quiet carpenter were building a kingdom of bones beneath your feet? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if this story has kept you company this far, go ahead and subscribe. There's more coming. The summer of 1810 is just around the corner. As the years passed, the Ashworth brothers began to treat death as a commodity, measured not by grief or legacy, but by educational value. They categorized every body, assigning it a tier based on condition rarity and instructional usefulness. Specimens with deformities or rare diseases brought the highest prices. Victims with strong musculature or clean anatomy fetched standard rates, and children tragically were often considered teaching gems for young surgeons just starting their studies. By 1812, the brothers weren't just selling corpses, they were taking custom orders. One ledger entry reads, "Subject secured to fulfill Dr. G's request for advanced tuberculosis example." Another even more chilling, female subject approx. 20, with childbearing characteristics as requested by Medical College of Virginia. Then came the War of 1812. While the conflict disrupted traditional trade, it also opened up new opportunities. Military surgeons, many hastily trained, were desperate for anatomical material. The Ashworths adapted. Ezekiel perfected his preservation techniques, extending storage life. Morai adjusted the packing crates to protect specimens during longer transport. Zachariah used the chaos of wartime to expand his traveling ministry, identifying isolated targets in new towns under the guise of charity. By the time peace returned in 1815, the brothers had amassed what would have been considered a fortune. Though they continued to live simply in Ashworth Creek, they secretly purchased extensive land holdings across Kentucky. Through proxies and fake names, they invested in business ventures in Lexington and Louisville. The ledgers suggest that their total earnings from the trade in bodies had surpassed $25,000, an almost unimaginable sum in early 19th century America. Between 1815 and 1820, the operation reached its peak. They were now shipping an average of 36 bodies per year, many to distant cities like Boston and Charleston. Their preservation techniques had become so advanced that some cadavers remained usable for weeks, even during summer heat. But what the Ashworths failed to notice was that the world around them was changing. The frontier was fading. Improved roads, meant more people traveling through previously isolated areas. New settlements began developing their own funeral services, reducing dependence on Ashworth Creek. And most critically, communication was improving. Letters were traveling faster. People were checking in on one another more often. And disappearances, once assumed to be accidents or misfortune, began to raise suspicions. If you've made it this far through the shadowed pages of the Ashworth ledger, you're not alone. These are the kinds of historical horrors that still haunt the archive stories that never made it into textbooks but should have. If this tale has chilled you, take a second to hit the like button. It helps more curious minds stumble into this darkness with us. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Sleepy History Tales brings you the kinds of true American nightmares the history books like to forget. Let's return now to eastern Kentucky in the autumn of 1820, where the Ashworths' carefully controlled world was about to unravel. The first crack appeared in the form of a man named James Caldwell, a prosperous farmer from central Kentucky. He passed through Ashworth Creek on his way to visit family in Virginia and decided to stop for Sunday service at the cemetery chapel. Zachariah greeted him warmly, always eager to welcome a new traveler. In Ezekiel's ledger dated September 24th, 1820, the following appears. Potential subject presented himself today. J. Caldwell, traveling alone to Virginia, plans return journey in 2 weeks. Well-dressed approx. 45 years. Excellent physical condition. Zachariah suggests we wait for his return. His disappearance would be attributed to the dangers of the Virginia road. 2 weeks later, October 9th, Caldwell returned and again attended Zachariah's service. Afterward, he was invited to dine at the Ashworth home. He accepted, and he became victim number 623. But what the Ashworths did not know was that Caldwell had recently married. His new bride, Elizabeth Harmon, was a widow 20 years his junior, and she expected him back at their farm near Lexington by October 15th. When the date passed with no sign of her husband, she didn't wait long. Unlike so many others before her, Elizabeth asked questions, and unlike the families of nameless travelers, she had means, connections, and determination. Elizabeth Caldwell's instincts would not let her rest. Though she carried herself with the grace of a newly wed widow, her eyes betrayed something harder determination, sharpened by grief and unease. She needed answers. In early December of 1821, Elizabeth made a calm, deliberate visit to the one man everyone in Ashworth Creek trusted without question, Reverend Zachariah Ashworth. She posed a simple question. If my husband had died on his return journey, what would your procedures have been? Zachariah, ever the picture of gentle authority, described their usual handling of a traveler's death. The body would be prepared with dignity. A simple funeral held in the chapel, a marked grave placed in the traveler's section of the cemetery. Your husband would have received God's full measure of respect in our care, Mrs. Caldwell Zachariah assured her with quiet gravity. Elizabeth smiled, thanked him, and left. But the next morning, she returned. This time she wasn't alone. With her stood Magistrate Turner, and she came armed with more than suspicion. She came with a story. I had a dream, she told Turner in Zachariah's presence, a dream where my husband called to me from this place. For my peace of mind, I need to open the recent traveler graves. Perhaps he is buried here," she added softly, misidentified, or without my knowledge. This wasn't just grief, it was strategy, because what Elizabeth knew, and the Ashworths did not, is that she had carefully built trust during her stay. She'd been kind, she'd asked questions, she'd listened, and now others were listening to her. The Ashworths panicked. They had no actual travelers buried in those graves. Murder victims were processed and shipped east immediately. The traveler graves were empty shells, stone-filled coffins meant to preserve the illusion of righteous care. They scrambled for solutions. Ezekiel cited religious impropriety. Zechariah warned of divine wrath. Morai muttered something about frozen ground, but it wasn't enough. The town began to murmur, and then came a voice the brothers never expected. Martha Tunney, widow of one of the cemetery's earliest burials, spoke at a community gathering. If it would ease the poor woman's heart to know her husband isn't buried here unrecognized, then Christian charity demands we help her. I would want the same comfort were I searching for my Henry in strange territory. That was all it took. Faced with rising support, public pressure, and Elizabeth's unwavering resolve, Magistrate Turner reluctantly approved the unthinkable. 3 traveler graves would be opened. The Ashworths were cornered. From Ezekiel's ledger, December 6, 1821, disaster looms. Turner has ordered grave examinations for tomorrow morning. We have no actual travelers buried in the marked plots. Morai suggests we exhume a local from last year and re-enter them overnight, but identification would be impossible after our methods. Only course is to allow the inspection, claim confusion over headstones, prepare for potential flight if suspicions intensify. And so on December 7th, the town gathered. Cold winds swept across Death Valley Cemetery as shovels cut into frozen earth. The first grave was marked Jonathan Y. Died Sept. 1820. After over an hour of labor, the coffin was raised, and when it was opened, gasps, whispers, silence. There was no body, just carefully arranged rocks wrapped in linens to mimic human shape and weight. Elizabeth turned her face white with vindication. Open the others. By midday, all 3 traveler graves had been opened. All 3 were empty. All 3 were lies. And then came the question, soft shaking but filled with fury. What is the meaning of this? Imagine standing in that winter wind, watching the illusion collapse. Would you have spoken up? Would you have defended the Ashworths? Or helped tear the curtain down? Let me know in the comments. And if this story has kept you glued to your seat, tap the like button and subscribe. There's more yet to come. The curtain has been lifted, and the reckoning is about to begin. Where are the bodies of these travelers? Magistrate Turner's voice trembled not with fear, but with disbelief. His once unshakable respect for the Ashworth brothers had begun to crumble in the cold light of truth. Zechariah, always the speaker, stepped forward with a performance honed over decades. "Grave robbers," he said calmly. "Surely some desperate souls stealing for reasons unknown. It might have worked in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, places where whispers of body snatchers weren't uncommon. But not here, not in Ashworth Creek." Elizabeth Caldwell, her eyes locked on Zechariah's, asked the question no one else dared voice. If grave robbers stole these bodies, why would they refill the coffins with rocks And how could they dig so deeply in multiple graves without anyone seeing or hearing a thing? A stillness fell over the crowd. The murmuring began. A tide was turning. Turner, visibly shaken, made the only move he could. He ordered the Ashworth brothers, confined to their home under armed guard, less to detain them and more to shield them from the rising anger in the town. 2 men stood watch through the night, but it wasn't enough. That evening, the brothers made their decision. Ezekiel's final words, preserved in the very ledgers that would doom them, were scrawled in his unmistakable hand. All is lost. The woman's persistence has undone decades of work. We have prepared for this contingency and will implement our escape plan tonight. Essential records and accumulated funds are secured in the designated location. God's work, as we have defined it, must continue elsewhere. And then, just before midnight, fire engulfed the Ashworth home. It was no accident. While the townspeople scrambled to form bucket lines, the brothers vanished into the Kentucky night, taking with them a wagon packed with supplies and coin. Their trail would soon disappear into snow-covered wilderness, but the flames they left behind didn't just consume their house, they exposed the truth. As the fire spread to the undertaking establishment, the back wall collapsed. Someone spotted a charred wooden hatch, a trapdoor hidden for years. When they pried it open and descended by lantern light into the cold red clay beneath, the full horror was revealed. 3 chambers, each one worse than the last. The first chamber held surgical tools, bizarre instruments, and rows of chemical jars labeled in scripts no local could decipher. The second contained 5 bodies preserved in eerie silence. One of them bore a golden ring, a wedding band. Elizabeth stepped forward, breath catching in her throat. "That's James," she whispered. "I knew it." A wife knows when she's being lied to about the man she loves, but it was the 3rd chamber that told the darkest story of all. They're stacked neatly on a stone shelf were 16 leather-bound ledgers. They were Ezekiel's. He hadn't burned them, hadn't taken them. Perhaps he couldn't bring himself to destroy the record of what they had done. And now the truth was laid bare for all to read. Page after page of dates, names, prices, and descriptions. A history written in the ink of betrayal and the silence of the dead. The next morning, Turner dispatched riders to Lexington and beyond. Authorities arrived within days. A physician examined the bodies in the cellar. His verdict: these techniques are textbook, precisely the kind used at every major medical college on the eastern seaboard. As news of the discovery spread, shockwaves rippled through the state. Settlements across Kentucky began reopening old graves, questioning deaths that had once seemed natural. Did the Ashworths handle your father's burial? My sister died on the road near Ashworth Creek. Do you think the scope of the investigation ballooned and the ledgers didn't lie? By the time every name was cross-checked, every grave examined, the final total stood at 637 victims, 37 years, 3 brothers. America's most prolific murderers hidden in plain sight. What would you have done standing in that cellar with only your lantern and your dread? Would you have turned away or read the ledgers yourself? Let me know in the comments. And if you've stayed with us this far, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button, not just to support this channel, but to help keep these forgotten stories alive. Because history, like the dead, doesn't rest easy when its truths remain buried. The investigation continued for nearly 2 full years, becoming one of the most extensive criminal inquiries of the 19th century. But authorities quickly discovered a harrowing reality. Many of the Ashworth's victims would never be identified. Most were solitary travelers, people without strong ties gone for decades, their names long forgotten. For them, the state did the only thing it could. At the eastern edge of what had once been Death Valley Cemetery, a mass grave was dug. Above it stood a single stone. Here lie the victims of man's inhumanity to man. 1784, 1821. Some families were able to confirm their loved ones' fates, and what they learned was heartbreaking. Martha Tunney, the very woman who once praised Zachariah Ashworth for his comforting sermons, discovered that her husband Henry had never been buried at all. He was shipment number 7, sold to a Philadelphia medical college just 2 days after his funeral. For 36 years, I brought flowers to an empty grave, Martha told the Lexington Gazette in 1822. I spoke to Henry, believing he was beneath that soil, to learn he was cut apart by strangers. There are no words for such a violation. The investigation into the medical professionals listed in the ledgers proved even more complex. Some were already dead. Others used wealth and power to evade justice. Several fled to Europe the moment news of the scandal broke. In the end, only 11 of the 43 named individuals faced formal charges, and just 4 were convicted. All received sentences that felt insultingly light given the scale of their crimes. Dr. William Hammond, whose infamous 1791 letter had urged the Ashworths to begin selecting fresh subjects, escaped entirely. By the time investigators reached Baltimore in 1823, he had already boarded a ship to England, vanishing forever from American shores. As for the Ashworth brothers, despite the most intensive manhunt of the era, with their descriptions circulated across every state and into Canada, not a single verified sighting was ever recorded, only rumors. 3 brothers running a small church in Missouri, an undertaker in western Pennsylvania whose embalming methods matched Ezekiel's, a Tennessee preacher named Thomas Blackwood, eerily similar to Zachariah. No one could prove anything, but everyone suspected everything. Judge Harrison, in his final report filed in 1825, wrote, "Men capable of maintaining such a facade of respectability while committing unspeakable crimes would find little difficulty creating new identities in the American frontier, where asking questions about a man's past is considered impolite at best." Even today, no one knows what happened to the Ashworth brothers. But the scars they left on early America, the mass grave, the empty coffins, the ledgers of blood, remind us that beneath every quiet town and peaceful cemetery may lie secrets we'd rather not unearth. The aftermath of the Ashworth brothers' crimes reverberated far beyond their quiet Kentucky settlement. In the years following their exposure, American medicine and death itself changed. Medical schools faced unprecedented scrutiny. Several states passed strict laws criminalizing the unauthorized sale or purchase of bodies for dissection. Yet, even with regulation, the shortage of cadavers continued well into the 20th century, and so did the black market. Meanwhile, across the Appalachian region, communities began developing new rituals to guard their dead. Multi-day wakes where the body was never left alone. Burial societies whose members personally oversaw every step of interment. And in some towns, the custom of sitting up with the dead, a night watch, beside the fresh grave lasting several days to deter would-be grave robbers. As for Ashworth Creek, its very name had become poisoned by association. In 1823, the settlement officially changed its name to Providence. Death Valley Cemetery was deconsecrated. Most families chose to exhume their loved ones, only to find in coffin after coffin nothing but rocks and soil. The cemetery was eventually abandoned, swallowed by the forest, until only one marker remained, the mass grave etched with a stark reminder of human cruelty. But perhaps the most lasting wound was psychological. The people had trusted the Ashworths completely. They had wept with Zachariah at funerals, clasped Ezekiel's hand in gratitude, admired Morai's craftsmanship in times of grief, and now they questioned whether they could trust anyone. We invited wolves into our fold and called them shepherds, wrote Rebecca Lansing, a long-time resident of the community. We gave them our dead to tend and never questioned when they grew prosperous from such somber work. What does it say about our discernment that men capable of such calculating evil were our most respected citizens? For nearly 40 years, the Ashworth case eventually faded from public memory. It was too disturbing for polite Victorian society. Newspapers occasionally referenced the Kentucky body merchants on anniversaries, but the full truth, dissection, deception, and mass murder was left to gather dust. By the early 1900s, the Ashworths had become little more than a macabre footnote in criminal history, a whisper in the margins, until 1918. A crew of road workers near Somerset, Kentucky, struck something metal beneath the soil, a box. Inside, 17 leather-bound ledgers. The original 16 had once been held as evidence, then seemingly lost to time. But the 17th volume had never been seen before. This final book was something else entirely. It contained detailed maps to hidden caches of money scattered across eastern Kentucky, a coded list of names, contacts who had agreed to help the brothers disappear if their operation was ever exposed, and most chilling of all, Ezekiel Ashworth's reflections, not words of regret, not pleas for forgiveness, but cold clinical pride. We have advanced medical knowledge more than any physicians of our era, he wrote in July 1821, just months before everything collapsed. We made death serve purpose. We offered the world progress paid for in silence and soil. The bodies we provided trained hundreds of doctors. If each physician saved even a handful of lives because of our work, have we not saved more than we ever took? So wrote Ezekiel Ashworth in what would become one of the most chilling justifications in American criminal history. History, should it ever judge us, he added, must consider this calculus. The rediscovery of the Ashworth ledgers in 1918. 17 volumes in all reignited public interest in a case nearly forgotten. Transferred to the Kentucky Historical Society, the ledgers were subjected to modern forensic and historical analysis, and what those researchers found was worse than anyone expected. The Ashworth's network had been far more expansive than 19th century officials ever realized. They had international ties, sending preserved bodies across the Atlantic to Edinburgh and Paris, using trusted sea captains who asked no questions. Their profits adjusted for inflation. The ledgers document more than 4 million in earnings, most of it never recovered, buried in secret caches, described in code that remains undeciphered to this day. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation, they were not alone. The ledgers contained correspondence with at least 7 other individuals or groups imitators, inspired by the Ashworth's methods, establishing similar operations in other isolated frontier communities. Ezekiel called it a new industry. The demand from medical science is insatiable, and we have demonstrated how it may be met by those with sufficient resolve. Our methods will endure even if we do not. Medical historians now believe that the unusual consistency in preservation techniques used on 19th century anatomical specimens suggests that Ezekiel's process became the gold standard, passed down through hidden channels like a morbid inheritance. The final pages of the 17th ledger outline the brothers' contingency plan: fake identities, properties in the Missouri Territory purchased under aliases, strategies for entering new towns without raising suspicion. Ezekiel's final entry: we begin again wiser for this experience. Zechariah will preach. I will preserve. One man draws no attention where 3 might. The work continues. Our methods must evolve. Their trail goes cold at the Mississippi River. Riverboat logs from early 1822 mention men matching their descriptions heading toward St. Louis. But after that, they vanish into the wilderness of American myth. And what of Elizabeth Caldwell, the widow who brought it all down? She remained in Kentucky. With part of her husband's estate, she opened a small school in Lexington, which would later grow into one of the state's most respected academies. She never remarried. Instead, she spent her life advocating for educational reform and ethical standards in medical training. In 1860, she granted a rare interview to the Louisville Courier. People ask if I feel proud to have uncovered such evil. She said, I feel no pride, only sorrow that James and hundreds of others were sacrificed on the altar of medical progress. If there's any consolation, it's that their deaths forced reforms that may have spared others. But I fear human nature changes slowly, if it changes at all. The Ashworth case, once buried by history's discomfort, reveals a terrifying truth that trusted figures, cloaked in respectability, can hide the most unthinkable horrors. That progress, even in medicine, can come at a cost measured in violated graves and stolen lives. And perhaps worst of all, that they may have gotten away with it. Because while Death Valley Cemetery is gone, reclaimed by the forest, its stones faded and names forgotten, the Ashworth legacy lives on, echoing in medical archives, university basements, and the bones of those who were never meant to be found. How many other horrors remain buried in ledgers no one's yet unearthed? How many other communities unknowingly built their trust on graves that never held the dead? If you've made it this far, You know that history's worst stories are rarely told in the classroom. Leave a comment. What do you think of the Ashworth brothers' legacy? Is their justification believable or bizarre? Will medical science ever accept knowledge built on such crimes? Hit the like button if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. Subscribe and turn on notifications to join our growing community of historical truth seekers. Because at Sleepy History, we believe the dead may rest in peace, but their stories deserve to live again.